The end of the Ottoman Empire can be dated exactly, but its beginnings remain shrouded in legend. On the 29th of October, 1923, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was proclaimed president of the new Republic of Turkey, a state founded on popular sovereignty and with borders recognized by the international community. A year earlier, the Republicans had stripped the last sultan of his political power, leaving him only his religious role. When they also abolished the caliphate in 1924, they definitively broke with the idea that Turkish authority depended on dynastic heritage. In his long speech before the parliament, Atatürk explained why his generation decided to abandon an exhausted imperial past and build a modern country. Only in recent times have the Turks been able to observe their history as something more than that of an Islamic power that rivaled Rome and fell to the west. For centuries it was a feared, diverse and long-lasting empire. But how did the Ottoman Empire manage to build a civilization that would dominate 3 continents and end up disappearing after more than 600 years of power? The dreamed origins, Osman and the birth of Ottoman power. The year 1299 is accepted as the symbolic date of the Ottoman origin, although no decisive battles were fought or formal proclamations made in that year. The reason is simpler. It coincided with the change of century in both the Christian and Islamic calendars. It was, therefore, a moment considered propitious to mark the birth of a state that would eventually spread between Europe and Asia. For the early Ottomans, the date mattered less than the spiritual vision that legitimized their right to govern. It all began with a dream. According to tradition, the first ruler Osman slept one night at the house of a sage named Edebali. In the dream, a moon emerged from the saint's chest and sank into his own. Then a tree sprouted from his navel, covering the entire world, with mountains and rivers under its shadow. People drank from its waters, watered fields and made springs flow. When Osman told him the dream, Edebali interpreted that God had delivered the imperial power to Osman and his descendants and offered him the hand of his daughter Malhun. That vision, transmitted in writing more than a century after his death around 1323, became the most enduring founding myth of the empire, justifying its rise against rivals competing for the dominance of Anatolia and the Balkans. At the beginning of the 14th century, the Ottomans were just one among many Turkoman tribes from Central Asia, disputing control of Anatolia, the extensive region between the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Aegean. For centuries it had been part of the Byzantine Empire, heir to the Eastern Roman Empire, with its capital in Constantinople, founded by Constantine the Great in the year 324. After the sacking of the city by the Crusaders in 1204, Byzantium lost a good part of its domains, and by the 14th century barely retained Constantinople, Thrace, Macedonia, and some enclaves in Greece and Anatolia. The Seljuk Turks had been the first Turkoman invaders to settle there. From Central Asia they had advanced westward at a time when Byzantium was weakened by internal disputes. In 1071, their Sultan Alp Arslan defeated Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes at Manzikert, near Lake Van, opening the way for massive migrations of nomads into the interior of Anatolia. The Seljuks established their capital in Iznik, and after losing it to the Crusaders, in Konya. In the following centuries, several minor emirates arose, such as the Danish Mens, Saltukids, Mengujakids, and Artukids, that filled the power vacuum. Anatolia became a mosaic of Kurds, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Muslims. In the 13th century, Seljuk power reached its peak under the name Seljuks of Rum, but that balance was broken with the arrival of the Mongols. In 1243, the descendants of Genghis Khan defeated the Seljuks at Kosadag, forcing them to become tributary vassals. The instability was aggravated by internal struggles and the intervention of the Mamluks from Egypt. By the end of the century, Mongol control in Anatolia was weak, and numerous Turkoman tribes took advantage of the vacuum to form their own emirates. Houses then emerged such as Teki in Antalya, Menteze and Aydin in the southwest, Hamid and Isfendiyar in the interior, Karaman in the center, Jermian in Kütahya, and Karesi in the northwest. In this last territory appeared Osman, chief of the Ottoman clan. In 1301, according to a Byzantine chronicler, his troops defeated an imperial army at the Battle of Baphius, near the Sea of Marmara. That minor victory marked the beginning of an expansion that would take decades to consolidate. The Ottomans shared with their neighbours the frontier life, continuous warfare and mobility. Their emirate, situated between the Byzantine ruins and the Mongol influence, took advantage of both faith and political opportunity. The geography of Anatolia, with its high plateau surrounded by mountains and fertile plains in the west, shaped their economy and their way of fighting. The Turkoman shepherds moved their flocks according to the seasons and traded with farmers in the coastal areas. These exchanges strengthened alliances that would be key to the birth of the new power. Osman's father, Ertugrul, had received lands from the Seljuks in Sogut, in the northwest of the country. A historical lineage is attributed to him, confirmed by an ancient coin bearing the inscription, "Minted by Osman, son of Ertugrul," a symbol of sovereignty. The location of these lands near Constantinople was strategic. The Ottomans competed with the Byzantine garrisons for control of villages and pastures. Although Osman unsuccessfully tried to take Iznik, his rural victories gave him a reputation and attracted new warriors. The Ottoman expansion coincided with the Byzantine crisis. Emperor Andronikos II sought alliances with the Mongols and then hired Catalan mercenaries to contain the Turks. But the foreign adventurers ended up looting on their own, spreading chaos. The borders were filled with displaced peasants, dervishes, monks, wandering soldiers, and merchants. This diverse environment favored leaders capable of imposing order. Osman and his successors integrated Muslims and Christians under a flexible command, something uncommon for the time. The first Ottoman documents show religious influence in their legitimacy. In 1324, his son Orhan donated land for a tekke or dervish lodge near Iznik, proof of the ties between the ruling family and the mystical orders. These religious communities helped populate new areas and maintained popular faith alongside official Islam. In Orhan's time, theological schools and mosques were founded, and leaders began to use titles such as Defender of the Faith. The term Ghazi, which designated fighters for the faith, was applied to the Ottoman warriors, although in that context it meant more like raider or armed adventurer. Later, chronicles exaggerated their religiosity, but in reality their motivation was both material and spiritual. The border between Christians and Muslims was not rigid. There were mixed marriages, military collaborations, and coexistence. Even high-ranking Byzantines served in the Ottoman court during the early centuries. Over time, the imperial chroniclers reinterpreted these beginnings to present them as a continuous Islamic crusade. This justified the supremacy of the Sultan and gave coherence to a dynasty that had begun among nomads. In later versions, it was said that Ertugrul had received his lands from the Seljuk Sultan, along with symbols of authority such as a banner and a robe of honor. Although the documents proving this turned out to be false, these stories consolidated the idea that the Ottomans were the legitimate heirs of the ancient power. Osman died around 1323 or 1324, leaving his son Orhan a domain extending between Sogut, Yenisehir, and Eskisehir. In 1326, Orhan took Bursa, making it his capital. From there, he continued the siege of Iznik, which fell in 1331, and later captured Izmit in 1337. The Byzantine resistance was crumbling. To maintain his conquests, Orhan began to organize a permanent army and a stable government, leaving behind the tribal structure. In those years, the Byzantine emperor attempted marital alliances and pacts with Christian and Muslim powers, but without success. His erratic policy allowed the Ottomans to consolidate in the region. When Orhan married Theodora, daughter of Emperor John VI Kantakouzenos, the Ottoman chroniclers omitted the mention so as not to weaken the Islamic image of the regime. During the decade of 1350, Orhan's son, Suleiman, crossed the Dardanelles with his troops and established the first Ottoman bases in Thrace, taking advantage of an earthquake that had destroyed the walls of Gallipoli. From then on, the expansion into the Balkans was unstoppable. Later, chroniclers attributed these advances only to the valor of the Ghazis, but in reality, many former allies of the Kheresi Emirate and various Turkish groups participated. Orhan died in 1362, and his son Murad I inherited a territory in full expansion. During his reign, the Ottomans took Didymoteicho, Adrianople, renamed Edirne, and extended their dominion as far as the Danube. The administration became more complex. The jurist Kara Halil became the first Grand Vizier and organized the judicial system. In 1389, on the plain of Kosovo, Murad's forces confronted the army of the Serbian Prince Lazar. The battle was long and bloody. In the end, both leaders died. The Ottoman victory consolidated their presence in the Balkans. Murad was succeeded by his son Bayezid, who secured the throne by eliminating his brother Yaqub. This began the practice of dynastic fratricide. Serbia remained a vassal, and Ottoman influence spread through Macedonia and Bulgaria. Birth of an empire, from the shadow of Tamerlane to the rise of Mehmed II. The defeat of Bayezid I by Tamerlane at the Battle of Ankara in 1402 left the Ottoman state on the brink of collapse. The Sultan was captured, his armies were scattered, and the cities that had obeyed his authority fragmented into the hands of local lords. The Mongols withdrew shortly after, but the damage was done. The dynasty that had advanced without pause since the time of Osman seemed to be falling apart. Bayezid's sons, deprived of a central power, began an internal struggle that lasted more than a decade, and which later chroniclers would call the interregnum. Tamerlane, after his victory, had reinstalled former rulers in Anatolia to weaken the Ottomans. In the following years, the region was filled with emirates seeking to reassert their independence. The most important cities, Bursa, Edirne and Amasya, fell into the hands of different Ottoman princes, each claiming legitimacy. Suleiman, one of Bayezid's sons, controlled Rumelia, the European part of the empire, with its capital in Edirne. In Anatolia, his brother Isa established himself in Bursa, while Mehmed, younger but ambitious, gathered support in Amasya. Another brother, Musa, remained Tamerlane's prisoner, although he was later released. Suleiman, from Edirne, tried to maintain stability with the support of Balkan nobles and Christian rulers. He signed pacts with Venice and Byzantium, returning cities and allowing free trade. But his authority was weak. In Anatolia, Isa soon lost ground to Mehmed, who defeated him near Bursa in 1405 and consolidated control over the western region. Meanwhile, Musa managed to escape from Asia and cross into Europe, where he sought revenge on Suleiman. With Mehmed's help, he landed in Gallipoli in 1410 and gathered troops among the dissatisfied Ghazis. During the following years, alliances constantly shifted. Musa managed to take Edirne and proclaim himself Sultan in 1411, but his harsh treatment of local notables isolated him. Mehmed then crossed to the continent and confronted him in Kosovo in 1413. The victory was his. With Musa's death, the conflict ended, and Mehmed, later known as Mehmed I, remained as the sole sovereign. His first objective was to restore central authority, damaged by the Fraternal War. Mehmed I tried to regain the trust of the lost territories. He re-established the administration, reorganized the treasury, and reinforced the loyalty of the provinces. The regions of eastern Anatolia remained under the influence of the Karaman Turkomans, but the Sultan avoided a direct offensive. He preferred to sign agreements with the minor beyliks, ensuring their nominal recognition. In Europe, the Balkan lords, especially the Serbs, again accepted vassalage in exchange for autonomy. Byzantium, weakened and surrounded, maintained its independence by paying tribute. During his reign, religious challenges also arose. In 1416, a rebellion erupted in Anatolia led by the preacher Bedreddin, a former judge who preached social equality and mixed Sufi ideas with notions of popular justice. His followers, peasants and unpaid soldiers, took cities and proclaimed the end of oppression. Mehmed brutally suppressed the uprising and ordered the leader executed, but the episode showed the internal tensions between state authority and spiritual movements. When Mehmed I died in 1421, he left a stabilized though fragile state. His son Murad II inherited both the rebuilt cities and the enemies waiting for the moment to attack. As soon as he ascended the throne, he had to face a conspiracy. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel II released Mustafa, a supposed son of Bayezid who had been held hostage, and presented him as the legitimate heir. Many former supporters of Musa joined him. Mustafa crossed into Europe with Byzantine support, but was defeated at Gallipoli and executed shortly thereafter. Byzantium did not stop. Shortly after, it promoted another pretender named Kusuk Mustafa, this time backed by Karaman. The revolt was also crushed, but it demonstrated that the court of Constantinople continued to play with the Ottoman divisions. Murad II learned from these blows. He consolidated his power and began a series of campaigns that marked the definitive recovery of the imperial impulse. In 1422, the Sultan tried to besiege Constantinople for the first time, although without success. The walls resisted, and the lack of coordination of his army forced him to retreat. Even so, this attempt confirmed that the Ottomans had again turned their attention to Europe. In the following years, Murad concentrated on subjugating the Balkans. In 1430, he took Thessaloniki, which had been under Venetian rule. During the following decade, his armies faced coalitions of Hungarians, Serbians and Albanians, led by figures like John Hunyadi and Skanderbeg. In 1444, after years of war, Murad signed the Peace of Szeged with Hungary and Poland, temporarily withdrawing from political life and leaving the throne to his son Mehmed, barely 12 years old. But the truce did not last. The Christians broke the agreement and advanced toward the Balkans. Murad returned to command the army and, at the Battle of Varna that same year, destroyed the crusade. His return confirmed his authority, although the experience made it clear that the balance between Europe and Anatolia was increasingly tense. During his second reign, Murad continued the military campaigns and extended the institutions of government. Under his administration, the imperial bureaucracy began to adopt more regular forms. The devshirme system was strengthened, the recruitment of young Christians who were educated as Muslims to serve in the army or administration. From this corps would emerge the Janissaries, an elite troop that would become the symbol of the Sultan's power. In 1451, Murad died, and Mehmed, now an adult, ascended the throne again as Mehmed II. Since his youth, he had shown ambition and discipline. Educated by religious tutors and military advisors, he spoke several languages and understood the importance of war and political legitimacy. His vision was clear: conquer Constantinople, the heart of Byzantium, and turn it into the capital of the Islamic world. As soon as he took office, he began to prepare for this undertaking. He reinforced the European border, reorganized the army, and ordered the construction of a new fortress on the banks of the Bosphorus, called Rumeli Hisari, intended to cut off the passage of ships supplying the Byzantine city. The message was evident: Constantinople was surrounded. At the same time, he ordered coins to be minted with his name and commanded a revision of the administrative code. The Byzantine Empire, reduced to the capital and some possessions in the Peloponnese, could barely resist. Emperor Constantine XI asked Rome for help, but the promises of support came late and further divided the population. The Turks prepared artillery with giant cannons cast by a Hungarian master named Orban, and during the winter of 1452 to 1453, Mehmed gathered an army of more than 100,000 men in Edirne, accompanied by a fleet in the Sea of Marmara. The siege began on April 6, 1453. The Theodosian walls, built 1,000 years earlier, were the city's last defense. The Ottoman cannons breached them day after day, while the fleet blocked the Golden Horn. The defenders, with about 7,000 soldiers, resisted with the help of Genoese volunteers. For weeks, the fighting continued without rest. Mehmed observed every movement from his tent, convinced that this conquest would mark a new era. After the conquest, Mehmed reorganized the administration to integrate the diverse peoples under his command. He appointed experienced viziers and established a permanent governing council. The Greek, Armenian and Jewish populations were encouraged to remain with their religious leaders officially recognized. Properties were distributed, buildings were reconstructed, and a land registry was established. The Sultan presented himself as the heir to both the ancient Roman emperors and the Islamic legacy. Between 1453 and the following years, he ordered the repair of aqueducts, bridges and fortifications. He ordered new commercial routes to be opened and granted privileges to Genoese and Venetian merchants. He transformed Istanbul into a center of trade between East and West. He also promoted the founding of schools, workshops and libraries. His vision was to create a universal state. That is why he adopted the title Kaiser-i Rom, that is, Caesar of Rome. His purpose was not only to rule over Muslims, but over all the peoples in his domains. The court was filled with scholars, translators, and architects. Administrative records that would serve for centuries were created. With the capture of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire transformed into a world power. The dynasty, which 40 years earlier had been divided by civil war, entered a new phase. From the ruins of the interregnum and the defeat of Ankara, the Ottomans had managed to reconstruct a centralized, disciplined state with imperial ambition. Mehmed II, later called the Conqueror, had fulfilled the dream that Osman had seen in his vision, to extend his shadow over lands and seas, shaping the empire that would dominate for nearly 500 years. The imperial greatness, Suleiman the Magnificent. After the capture of Constantinople, Mehmed II turned the military victory into the axis of a new political structure. The city, renamed Istanbul, was transformed into the seat of his government and a symbol of Ottoman power. From the first months, he ordered the walls to be rebuilt, the rubble to be cleared, and inhabitants from all provinces to be relocated. Muslim families arriving from Anatolia were joined by Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, forcibly transferred, with the intention of reviving urban life. Abandoned lands were allocated through a registration system that guaranteed income to the imperial treasury. The Sultan reorganized the imperial administration and divided power between two institutions: the religious authority, headed by the Seyhul Islam, and the political authority, directed by the Imperial Council or Divan. The Grand Vizier, responsible for daily decisions, was the main intermediary between the monarch and the bureaucracy. The capital filled with officials, translators, architects, and jurists who formed the nucleus of the new state. Mehmed II promoted the codification of administrative and fiscal rules, later known as Kanunname. These laws complemented the Sharia and served to maintain uniformity in diverse provinces. Each region had to send records of taxes, crops, and population, while imperial judges supervised the application of justice. Control of the territory depended on the timer, land concessions given to the army cavalrymen in exchange for military service. With this system, the Sultan maintained a standing army without needing to rely on hereditary nobles. During the same era, the Janissary Corps was strengthened. Young men recruited through the Dev Sirme, the tribute in Christian boys, were educated in discipline and absolute loyalty. After their training, they could become elite soldiers or high-ranking officials. This system eliminated family ties and guaranteed direct dependence on the Sultan. The Janissaries became the principal instrument of his authority, obeying only his command. Mehmed was not limited to ruling from Istanbul. In 1454, he led campaigns to secure control of Serbia, and 2 years later, he conquered the disintegrating despotate of Morea. In 1459, after the fall of Smederevo, Serbia was incorporated into the empire. In 1461, his troops advanced on Trebizond, the last bastion of the Byzantine Empire. Its ruler, David Komnenos, was captured and executed shortly after. With that victory, the last branch of Byzantine power disappeared. Between 1463 and 1479, the Ottomans confronted Venice for possession of ports in the Adriatic and the Aegean. The war was long and costly, with fighting in the Peloponnese, Albania, and the sea. Finally, the Treaty of 1479 confirmed Turkish hegemony in the eastern Mediterranean. In 1473, Mehmed also defeated Uzun Hasan, ruler of the Akkoyunlu in eastern Anatolia, securing dominion over the country's interior. The Sultan promoted the construction of public buildings, mosques, schools, and hospitals. His biggest project was the Topkapi Palace, erected on a hill overlooking the Bosphorus. The government spaces, treasury warehouses, armory, and harem were concentrated there. The complex reflected the hierarchy of the state. Access to the dependencies was graded, from the outer courtyard to the sovereign's private chambers. European ambassadors described the court's organization and protocol with astonishment. During his reign, artistic and literary production reached a notable level. Poets, calligraphers, and chroniclers were invited to the capital. Mehmed possessed an extensive library and commissioned portraits from Italian painters, including Gentile Bellini, who traveled to Istanbul in 1479 by order of the Doge of Venice. The presence of the European artist showed the Sultan's will to integrate into the political culture of the Mediterranean. Mehmed's personal power aroused resistance within his circle. His centralization policy affected old families of servants and religious leaders. When he died in 1481, during a campaign against southern Italy, he left a stable empire but with internal tensions. His sons Bayezid and Cem disputed the succession. Cem, defeated, sought refuge in Rhodes and then in Rome, where he was held by Pope Innocent VIII as a political pawn against the Turks. Bayezid II ruled between 1481 and 1512. focusing his attention on internal administration. Under his command, the fiscal system was consolidated and coastal cities were strengthened. In 1492, after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, Bayezid allowed them to settle in Ottoman lands, considering them useful for trade and crafts. Istanbul and Salonika received thousands of Sephardic refugees who introduced new techniques and languages. Meanwhile, trade with Venice and Genoa remained essential for the empire's supply. Bayezid's period was more peaceful than his father's, although it was not free of conflict. In Anatolia, revolts of dervishes and Turkoman tribes showed discontent with central authority. In the west, the Hungarians and the Mamluks of Egypt represented permanent threats. However, his main problem was internal, the rise of his son Selim, governor of Trabzon, who gathered an army with the support of the border troops. In 1512, Selim overthrew his father and assumed the throne with the title of Selim I. Selim had a different vision of power. His priority was to expand the empire toward the sacred centers of Islam and control the eastern trade routes. In 1514, he marched against the Safavids of Persia, led by Shah Ismail, whose followers propagated the Shia doctrine. At the Battle of Chaldiran, the Ottoman artillery secured the victory, marking the border between both empires. The triumph consolidated the Sultan's authority over eastern Anatolia. 2 years later, in 1516, Selim led a new campaign against the Mamluks of Syria and Egypt. At Mar Dabik, near Aleppo, he defeated the Mamluk army and advanced toward Cairo, which fell in 1517. The conquest of Egypt allowed the Sultan to take possession of the Prophet's relics and assume the title of Caliph, recognized by the ulemas. With this, the Ottoman Empire proclaimed itself protector of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Selim reorganized the administration of the new provinces, respecting local hierarchies but under direct supervision. Egypt was governed by a viceroy or beylik, while fiscal revenues were integrated into the central system. The Hijaz caravans remained under Ottoman custody, and the annual sending of subsidies to the holy places became tradition. In the ports of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, the Turks began to compete with the Portuguese fleets, who sought to dominate the spice trade. The Sultan returned to Istanbul in 1518, transformed into a sacred figure. During his last years, he reinforced military control and closely monitored heterodox religious groups. His reign was brief but decisive. He expanded the empire from the Danube to the Nile and from the Persian Gulf to the Adriatic. He died in 1520, leaving the throne to his son Suleiman, who inherited the most powerful structure in the Islamic world. Suleiman I, known as the Magnificent in Europe and as the lawgiver by the Turks, rose to power at the age of 26. His reign, between 1520 and 1566, represented the empire's highest point. He continued the military campaigns, reformed the administration, and consolidated the law. In 1521, he took Belgrade, the gateway to the Danube. 1 year later, he conquered the island of Rhodes, expelling the Knights of St. John, who later moved to Malta. The Ottoman advance into Europe reached its climax in 1526 with the Battle of Mohacs, where the Hungarian army was destroyed and its King Louis II died in combat. The victory allowed the occupation of Buda and converted much of Hungary into an Ottoman province. In 1529, Suleiman besieged Vienna, although the siege failed due to bad weather and logistics. Even so, Turkish power was consolidated in the Balkans. In the Mediterranean, the Ottoman fleet commanded by Barbarossa dominated the trade routes. In 1534, he captured Tunis and, after losing it, temporarily recovered it. In 1538, he defeated the Holy League in the Battle of Preveza, securing naval control of the Aegean. Meanwhile, in the east, the wars against the Safavids continued. In 1535, the Peace of Amasya was signed, which fixed the borders with Persia for decades. Suleiman's reign was also characterized by his administrative capacity. He gathered jurists to compile the legal codes, merging Islamic law with royal ordinances. His main collaborator was the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, who came from the Devshirme system. Together, they promoted fiscal and justice reforms. In 1536, Ibrahim was executed by order of the Sultan in an episode that showed the harshness of central power. The influence of the palace grew even more with Hürrem, the Sultan's legal wife, known in the West as Roxolana. Her presence at court changed the internal dynamics. She promoted her sons and protégés, favoring her son Selim as heir. Through her, the role of the harem as a political space was reinforced. Suleiman promoted great public works. He ordered the construction of the Süleymaniye Mosque, designed by the architect Mimar Sinan, and financed aqueducts, bridges and hospices. Istanbul became one of the most populated and richest cities in the world. European ambassadors described it as the center of an empire that extended over 3 continents. During his last years, the Sultan led campaigns in Hungary and against the Persians. In 1566, during the siege of Sigetvar, he died in his tent. His body was taken to Istanbul and buried next to the mosque that bears his name. His reign marked the closing of imperial expansion and the beginning of an era of prolonged stability. Crisis in the palace and rebellions in the provinces. After the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire entered a period of internal transformation that marked the end of continuous expansion and the beginning of tensions in the administration. His son Selim II ascended the throne in 1566 and was the first to almost completely delegate military campaigns to his generals. He spent much of his reign in the palace, supervising state affairs from Istanbul. Under his command, the figure of the Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, a former Janissary of Serbian origin, was consolidated, becoming the true manager of the empire. Sokolu reorganized the treasury and the army, maintaining the stability achieved during the previous reign. He led operations in the eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea, and planned engineering projects such as the canal between the Don and the Volga, which sought to connect the Caspian with the Black Sea. In 1571, the Turks occupied Cyprus, but that same year the Ottoman fleet was destroyed by Christian forces at the Battle of Lepanto. Although the defeat had great symbolic impact, the imperial arsenals had rebuilt the navy in 1 year. In 1574, Tunis was recovered from Spanish hands, reaffirming the empire's naval power. Selim II died that same year, leaving the throne to his son Murad III. The new sultan inherited a system where real power was in the hands of the palace administration and influential families of the divan. During his government, state spending increased and the military land system began to show signs of wear. The need to finance campaigns in Persia and against North Africa led to minting currency with less value and selling administrative positions. Social tensions grew over the years. Peasants, pressured by taxes, abandoned their villages and joined armed groups known as Selali. These bands attacked caravans and entire towns, becoming a constant threat. In the provinces of Anatolia and Syria, governors could barely contain the revolts. The expansion of corruption affected all levels. Officials who bought their positions tried to recoup their investment through local exactions. The court became increasingly closed. Murad III remained in the inner chambers of the palace, surrounded by eunuchs and advisors. His wife, Safiye Sultan, exercised considerable influence, extending her network of allies. Viziers and military chiefs competed for her favor, which led to intrigues and frequent changes in government. The role of the Sultan as head of campaign disappeared. Armies acted under the command of generals who reported to the Grand Vizier. Upon Murad's death in 1595, his son Mehmed III inherited an empire divided by factions. The new Sultan began his reign with a practice common since the time of Mehmed II, the execution of his brothers to avoid succession disputes. On this occasion, 19 princes were strangled. During his government, the war against the Habsburgs took place, known as the Long War, which extended between 1593 and 1606. Campaigns in Hungary consumed resources and men, and military discipline deteriorated. The defeat at the Battle of Mezocarestes in 1596 was followed by looting and disorder in the army. The Janissaries, poorly paid, began to intervene in political affairs. In Anatolia, the Selali rebels multiplied under the command of former unemployed officers. In 1603, the Vizier Kuyuku Murad Pasha undertook a mass repression, executing thousands of insurgents. Although he temporarily restored order, the human cost was enormous. When Mehmed III died in 1603, the throne passed to his son Ahmed I, aged 14. His reign marked an attempt to restore central authority. He cancelled the execution of his brothers and allowed the survival of minor princes within the palace, which would later change the succession system. In the religious sphere, he promoted the construction of the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, better known as the Blue Mosque, completed in 1616. During his government, the Peace of Zitvatarok was signed with the Habsburgs in 1606, which recognized a more balanced status between both powers. Control of the state remained in the hands of the Grand Vizier and the harem. The mothers of the sultans, known as Valid Sultan, assumed political functions when their sons were minors or inexperienced. Kösem Sultan, mother of Murad IV and Ibrahim I, became one of the most influential figures of the century. Her authority marked the beginning of the so-called Sultanate of Women, a stage where palace decisions were made between eunuchs, viziers, and the ladies closest to the throne. After the death of Ahmed I in 1617, a new succession criterion was established. The throne passed to the oldest male of the family instead of the direct son of the previous sultan. Thus ascended Mustafa I, Ahmed's brother, who had spent his life in confinement within the palace. His government was brief and chaotic. He was deposed and restored 2 times before being replaced by Osman II in 1618. Osman II tried to restore military discipline and reduce the influence of the Janissaries. His defeat in the Hotan campaign in 1621 against Poland weakened his authority, and his attempts to reform the army provoked his downfall. In 1622, the Janissaries assassinated him during a revolt in the palace itself, marking one of the most violent episodes in Ottoman history. Power fell into the hands of Murad IV, who ascended the throne as a minor. During his childhood, the regency was in the hands of Kösem Sultan. When he reached maturity, he took control and was characterized by his severity. Murad IV imposed military discipline and severe prohibitions within Istanbul, such as the consumption of alcohol and tobacco. In 1635 and 1638, he personally led campaigns against the Persians, conquering Baghdad and restoring imperial authority in the east. His reign temporarily restored the image of strength lost after decades of weakness. Murad IV died in 1640 without adult heirs. He was succeeded by his brother Ibrahim I, known for his unstable character. His lack of interest in government allowed the viziers and the harem to accumulate power. During his reign, economic tensions worsened and corruption spread. In 1648, a new revolt of the Janissaries ended with his deposition and execution. The ascent of Mehmed IV, still a child, returned the regency to Kösem Sultan, but she was displaced by Turan Hatise, the new sultan's mother. By the mid-17th century, the empire faced a general crisis. In Anatolia, the rebellions of the pashas and fiscal disorders showed that central authority could barely maintain control. The provinces acted independently, treasury revenues diminished, and inflation reduced the value of the currency. In the army, the Taimar had lost its original function. The campaign cavalrymen transformed into tax collectors or mercenaries. Vizier positions were bought and sold, and the loyalty of officials depended on payments. The Grand Viziers attempted to impose reforms, but each attempt met resistance from palace factions or the troops. During this stage, foreign policy lost momentum. Wars with Persia continued without decisive results, and in Europe the borders remained stable. The empire survived thanks to its administrative structure, but effective power was divided among those who controlled the court, the army, and the provinces. By around 1650, the system that had sustained Ottoman expansion for 2 centuries was exhausted. The sultans rarely left the palace, the armies no longer obeyed with discipline, and revenues were insufficient to finance the campaigns. Internal rebellions, factional struggles, and dependence on the harem marked the end of the stability that had characterized the era of Suleiman. Imperial greatness had given way to an era of adjustments, where the empire had to learn to survive without conquering. Power and adaptation between crisis and precarious balance. After decades of crisis, the Ottoman Empire entered a phase of internal readjustment under the reign of Mehmed IV. His ascent to the throne in 1648, still a child, coincided with the need to restore control after years of instability. The regency of his mother, Turan Hatise, had the support of the Grand Vizier Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, who in 1656 assumed power with broad faculties to reorganize the administration. His appointment marked the beginning of a new era in which the authority of the vizierate became the axis of government. Köprülü reformed finances, reorganized the army, and confronted corruption. He demanded absolute obedience and applied severe punishments to officials who failed to comply with his orders. In a few years, he re-established military discipline and confidence in central authority. He suppressed rebellions in Anatolia and secured control over the trade routes of the Aegean Sea. His administration strengthened the figure of the Grand Vizier as the effective head of government, while the Sultan remained in the palace. Upon his death in 1661, his son Fazil Ahmed Köprülü inherited the position. He continued his father's policy with energy and undertook military campaigns to regain prestige. In 1663, he led the army against the Habsburgs and took the fortress of Neuhäusel, although he failed to occupy Vienna. 3 years later, he signed the Treaty of Wasva, which consolidated the border and ensured temporary peace. His attention then focused on the eastern Mediterranean. In 1669, after a prolonged siege, the Ottomans conquered the island of Crete, ending 24 years of war with Venice. During the following years, Istanbul regained stability. The viziers of the Köprülü family maintained control of the government and implemented measures to improve trade and finances. The fiscal system was revised, and new registries were introduced to control tax collection. Trade with Europe increased thanks to agreements signed with France, England, and Holland, which obtained customs privileges in exchange for supplying manufactured products. The apparent prosperity was interrupted in 1683, when the empire again confronted Austria. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha led the Ottoman army to the gates of Vienna, confident of repeating past victories. However, the Christian coalition led by the Polish king John Sobieski defeated the Turkish forces, forcing them to retreat in disorder. Kara Mustafa was executed by order of the Sultan, accused of having caused the disaster. The defeat of Vienna marked the beginning of a series of setbacks. In the following years, the Habsburgs, Poland, Venice, and Russia joined forces in the so-called Holy League. In 1686, the Ottomans lost Buda, and in 1687 Belgrade fell into Austrian hands. The defeats caused a military revolt in Istanbul, which deposed Mehmed IV and placed his brother Suleiman II on the throne. The new sultan delegated command to Fazil Mustafa Köprülü, the younger brother of the previous vizier. His reforms restored some efficiency to the army, but were not enough to stop the European advance. In 1697, the Ottoman army was defeated again at Zenta. The following year, the Treaty of Karlowitz forced the empire to cede Hungary and Transylvania to the Habsburgs, and Morea to Venice. It was the first time that the empire signed an agreement that recognized permanent territorial losses. Despite the blow, the internal structures were maintained. In 1703, after the death of Mustafa II, the revolt known as the Edict of 1703, or the Edirne Rebellion, broke out. The Janissaries marched towards the capital demanding the return of Sultan Ahmed III, who was enthroned after the deposition of his brother. His reign opened a period of cultural and diplomatic recovery that would later be known as the Tulip era. During this stage, the court adopted European customs. Gardens, fountains, and palaces inspired by French models were built. Grand Vizier Nevşehirli Damat Ibrahim Pasha promoted trade and diplomatic relations, sending permanent embassies to Paris and Vienna. On the military front, Ahmed III tried to maintain a balance between modernization and tradition. In 1711, the Ottoman troops obtained a victory against the Russians at Prut, recovering part of the lost prestige. In 1715, the war with Venice led to the reconquest of the Peloponnese, followed by new clashes with Austria. 3 years later, in 1718, the Treaty of Passarowitz fixed new borders. The Turks lost Serbia and part of Bosnia, but secured peace with Europe for more than a decade. This stability allowed the capital to be transformed. Between 1718 and 1730, Istanbul experienced a time of social refinement. Printing presses, ceramic workshops, and silk manufactories multiplied. Court life became more luxurious, while the Grand Viziers concentrated power and wealth. The government became a system of balance between the factions of the harem, the viziers, and the military. In this climate of prosperity, in 1720, Yirmiseki's Mehmed Celebi was appointed ambassador to France and wrote a detailed report on life in Versailles, which aroused great interest among the Ottoman elite. The enthusiasm for Western culture, however, generated opposition. The ulemas and the janissaries viewed the reforms as a threat to Islamic traditions. In 1730, a revolt erupted led by Patrona Halil, a former merchant of Albanian origin. The insurgents invaded the capital, destroyed the palace gardens, and executed Grand Vizier Damat Ibrahim Pasha. Ahmed III was forced to abdicate in favor of Mahmud I. Mahmud I inherited an empire shaken by the insurrection, but managed to re-establish order. He promoted the reconstruction of the fleet and reorganized the artillery. In 1736, Russia and Austria simultaneously attacked the Ottoman borders, leading to new wars. The campaigns were difficult, but the Treaty of Belgrade in 1739 returned part of Serbia to the Ottomans and guaranteed a prolonged truce. During this period, the figure of the Grand Vizier again dominated politics. Provincial governors assumed military and fiscal functions, administering entire regions as if they were personal domains, but under the nominal authority of the Sultan. Decentralization was consolidated. The powerful ayan, or local notables, controlled private armies and collected taxes. In exchange, they sent a portion to the imperial treasury and maintained regional stability. Meanwhile, trade with Europe expanded. Ottoman goods, especially textiles, coffee and spices, circulated through Mediterranean and Black Sea ports. European powers increased their influence through treaties that granted them fiscal and legal privileges. In cities like Smyrna or Aleppo, French and English merchants established consulates and trading posts. The economy was increasingly integrated into global trade circuits. In the religious sphere, the ulemas retained their prestige, but their political role diminished. The most important decisions came from the divan and the viziers. The administration became more bureaucratic and dependent on scribes and accountants. The army, although numerous, had become costly and inefficient. Attempts to reform it met with resistance from the janissaries, who retained inherited privileges. Towards the mid-18th century, the internal balance was maintained through tacit pacts. The provinces enjoyed broad autonomy, the factions in Istanbul shared power, and the empire was sustained more by inertia than by initiative. The military splendor of previous centuries had been left behind, replaced by a pragmatic administration system. In 1740, under the reign of Mahmud I, new agreements were signed with France that expanded commercial privileges and confirmed economic dependence on Europe. Diplomatic relations intensified, but also revealed the technical and military backwardness compared to Western powers. Upon the death of Mahmud I in 1754, his successor Osman III inherited a seemingly stable but structurally fragile state. The reforms had slowed the collapse without resolving the underlying problems. The empire no longer expanded. It sought to maintain its position among European kingdoms through negotiations and adjustments. Between 1650 and 1750, the Ottoman Empire moved from crisis to a stage of adaptation. Administrative reforms, reconstruction campaigns, and diplomatic openness served to preserve unity. However, the loss of territories in Europe and the growing foreign influence demonstrated that the balance achieved was temporary. What had been a conquest machine was transforming into a state that was learning to survive in a rapidly changing world. Dominant provinces and the dawn of political change. In the second half of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire remained an extensive structure, but its effective control had shifted towards the provinces. From the Topkapi Palace, the sultans maintained the appearance of authority, although real power lay with the Grand Viziers and regional notables. Mahmud I, Osman III and Mustafa III succeeded to the throne during those years, attempting to balance internal stability with the pressure from European powers that were gaining influence in the Balkans and the Mediterranean. The ayan system, the provincial chiefs, consolidated as the basis of local administration. They were powerful families who collected taxes, maintained militias, and guaranteed order in exchange for autonomy. In Anatolia, Syria, and the Balkans, many governors acted as regional princes, sending only a portion of the revenues to the imperial treasury. By the mid-18th century, this network of decentralized power supported the daily functioning of the empire, but at the same time limited the center's ability to impose reforms. During the reign of Mustafa III, between the years 1757 and 1774, the need to modernize the army was perceived. Recent campaigns had shown that European artillery and tactics surpassed the Ottoman ones. The Sultan tried to reorganize military training and hired foreign advisors, but internal resistance prevented lasting changes. In those years, the viziers concentrated on maintaining financial administration and controlling corruption, which affected both the provincial courts and the state's own arsenals. Meanwhile, European powers increased their pressure. Russia, under the government of Catherine II, sought access to the Black Sea and expansion into the Balkans. In 1768, a new war broke out between both empires. Russian troops advanced through Ukraine and defeated the Ottoman armies in a series of decisive battles. In 1770, the Russian fleet destroyed the Ottoman squadron at Sesme, demonstrating the empire's naval inferiority. The conflict ended with the Treaty of Kusuk-Kainaka in 1774. Its clauses were severe. Russia obtained the right to protect the Orthodox Christians of the empire and commercial access to the Black Sea. Crimea, until then Ottoman territory, was declared independent, although it soon fell under Russian domination. This agreement marked a turning point in Ottoman foreign policy, showing that it could no longer successfully confront European powers. Abdulhamid I, who ascended the throne after the war, inherited an empire in crisis. His priority was to restore financial administration and secure the borders. To strengthen the army, he tried to reorganize the artillery corps and created gunpowder and weapons factories in Istanbul. He also introduced military censuses and revised land registries, but the resistance of the Janissaries and provincial governors halted any attempt at centralization. At the end of the 18th century, continuous defeats and the loss of territories had weakened the prestige of the Sultan. In 1789, Selim III ascended the throne with the idea of recovering imperial authority. Educated in the palace and aware of the situation, he promoted an ambitious reform program known as Nizam-e-Sedid, the New Order. His objective was to modernize the army and the state apparatus following the European model, especially the French one. Selim created new infantry units trained by foreign instructors, installed military academies, and ordered the construction of barracks equipped with modern artillery. He also reformed the tax system to finance these projects, establishing a separate fund called Irad-e-Sedid. Permanent embassies in London, Paris and Vienna began to send reports on technical and political innovations. However, the opposition was immediate. The Janissaries, who saw their privileges endangered, joined conservative sectors of the administration and the clergy. During the first years, reforms advanced with difficulty. In 1791, the Treaty of Sistova ended the war with Austria, but shortly after Russia resumed hostilities. Selim tried to strengthen the fleet and improve the defenses of the Danube, although resources were insufficient. The provinces continued to act autonomously, and the Ayan maintained their own armies. One of them, Tepedelenli Ali Pasha of Yanina, came to govern Albania and part of Greece as a practically independent state, maintaining nominal loyalty to the Sultan. The crisis worsened in Egypt. In 1798, French troops led by Napoleon Bonaparte invaded the country, defeating the Mamluks and occupying Cairo. The European advance on Ottoman territory alarmed Istanbul. Russia and the United Kingdom offered help to expel the French, and in 1801 an agreement was signed that restored Egypt to the empire. However, the French withdrawal left a power vacuum that would be occupied by Mehmed Ali, an Albanian officer who had served in the Ottoman army. Mehmet Ali took advantage of internal divisions to ascend. In 1805, he was recognized by the Sultan as governor of Egypt, but in practice he acted independently. He reformed the army following European models, introduced mandatory recruitment, and organized armament factories. His administration reorganized taxes and nationalized agricultural lands to finance modernization. Over time, Egypt became the clearest example of how a province could transform into an autonomous power within the empire. While Mehmet Ali consolidated his authority, the political situation in Istanbul deteriorated. In 1807, a Janissary revolt broke out against Selim III's reforms. The Sultan was deposed and subsequently assassinated. His cousin Mustafa IV occupied the throne, but his reign was short. A group of modernist officials, led by Mustafa Bayraktar, governor of Rumelia, intervened in the capital and restored Mahmud II as the new sultan. Mahmud II inherited a divided state and an undisciplined army. His priority was to regain control over the armed forces. In 1820, he began planning the elimination of the Janissary Corps, which he considered an obstacle to centralization. He reorganized the ministries, established civil registries, and limited the influence of the clergy in administrative matters. His purpose was to rebuild the state on modern foundations, but resources and political support were scarce. During this time, the empire also faced uprisings in the Balkans. In Serbia, armed peasant rebellions against the abuses of the Janissaries transformed into a national movement. Between 1804 and 1813, under the leadership of Karađorđe, the Serbians obtained partial autonomy before being repressed. In Greece, secret conspiracies known as Philiki were preparing an insurrection that would break out shortly after. The loss of control in the provinces was accompanied by foreign intervention. Russia and Austria supported the Balkan Christian movements, while France and Great Britain competed for influence in the eastern Mediterranean. Commercial treaties with European powers multiplied, guaranteeing customs advantages and reducing Ottoman economic sovereignty. In Egypt, Mehmed Ali continued to act as an independent ruler. In 1811, he eliminated the Mamluks in a planned massacre at the citadel of Cairo, consolidating his absolute power. His armies participated in campaigns in Arabia, where they defeated the Wahhabi movement and recovered the holy cities. With his military and economic control, Egypt became a reformist center that rivaled the authority of the Sultan. Mahmud II observed this new balance with concern. He tried to replicate some Egyptian reforms, but encountered opposition in Istanbul. Even so, he managed to introduce European uniforms, create a new military engineering school, and modernize the fleet. However, the Greek rebellion in 1821 and the war that followed highlighted the limitations of the system. Mehmed Ali sent Egyptian troops to support the Sultan, but his intervention increased his political weight. The time of the Tanzimat. In the first decades of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire faced a profound transformation. Military defeats, territorial losses, and the pressure of European powers had made it clear that the old system could not be sustained. Mahmud II, on the throne since 1808, took on the task of reorganizing the state. His government coincided with the advance of nationalism in the Balkans and the challenge posed by the growing autonomy of Egypt under Mehmed Ali. Mahmud II began his reign by attempting to re-establish imperial authority. In 1826, he ordered the elimination of the Janissaries, whose power had blocked reforms for centuries. With the support of the official clergy and the new army, the Sultan ordered their barracks to be surrounded and bombarded the barracks in Istanbul. The episode, known as the Auspicious Incident, dissolved the Janissary Corps and paved the way for the creation of a modern army, formed according to European models. This event marked the beginning of a modernization process that sought to strengthen the administration and redefine the relationship between the center and the provinces. During the following years, Mahmud II reorganized the ministries, established a council of state, and promoted the creation of technical and military schools. He introduced Western-style uniforms and abolished the use of the turban among officials, replacing it with the fez as a symbol of unity. In 1831, he ordered a general census to be carried out and created a system of provinces administered by governors appointed from Istanbul. However, resistance from the regions was strong. In Egypt, Mehmed Ali took advantage of the center's weakness to expand. His troops occupied Syria and threatened to advance toward Anatolia. In 1839, the imperial army was defeated at Nizip, and shortly after, the Ottoman fleet surrendered to the Egyptians. The crisis forced the European powers to intervene. In 1840, an international agreement forced Mehmed Ali to withdraw, although he retained the hereditary governorship of Egypt. The participation of England, Austria, Prussia and Russia in the settlement showed that the empire's survival already depended on the European diplomatic balance. That same year, Mahmud II died, leaving the throne to his son Abdulmajid I. In the first months of his reign, the young sultan proclaimed a decree that became a symbol of the new era, the Hati Serif of Gulhan, known as the Tanzimat. Read in the palace gardens by Foreign Minister Mustafa Rezid Pasha, it promised personal security, equality before the law, and a just administration for all subjects, without distinction of religion. It also guaranteed private property and regular tax collection. The Tanzimat aimed to reform the empire from its foundations. Starting in 1839, new laws, schools and ministries were promoted. Officials were required to train at the newly created School of Administration, where they learned French and accounting. Civil and penal codes inspired by European models were drafted. Justice was organized into mixed courts for Muslims and non-Muslims. These measures sought to create a centralized state capable of integrating into the international system. During the following years, Reşid Pasha, Ali Pasha and Fuad Pasha became the main architects of the reforms. Their policy was based on modernizing without breaking with Islamic tradition. The army was reorganized with foreign instructors, the telegraph network was expanded, and the infrastructure of ports and roads was improved. The capital was transformed. Avenues were opened, ministries were built, and official printing presses were introduced. On the international level, the empire maintained an ambiguous position. In 1853, the Crimean War broke out between Russia and an alliance formed by the Ottoman Empire, France, and Great Britain. The Allies sought to curb Russian expansion into the Black Sea. Ottoman troops participated in the campaigns of Sevastopol and received technical and financial support from Europe. The victory, sealed in 1856, gave the Ottomans a brief respite. That same year, Abdülmecid promulgated the Hati Humayun, a new edict that expanded the guarantees of the Tanzimat. It established complete equality of rights between Muslims and non-Muslims, authorized the entry of Christians into the administration, and provided for the construction of schools and hospitals in all provinces. However, the reforms generated tensions. Internally, the ulemas and religious leaders saw them as a threat to Islamic law. In the Balkans, Christian populations demanded more autonomy. The Crimean War also left a large debt. To finance modernization, the state contracted loans with European banks. Financial dependence became a chronic problem. As the decade of 1860 progressed, fiscal revenues were insufficient to cover the interest on the debt, which limited the government's ability to continue the reforms. In 1861, Abdülmecid died and was succeeded by his brother Abdülaziz. His reign maintained the reformist orientation, although the initial enthusiasm began to wear off. The navy was modernized, railways were expanded, and state banks were established. The army received new uniforms and military academies were founded in the capital. In 1867, the Sultan made a trip to Europe, visiting Paris, London and Vienna, the first by an Ottoman sovereign to the west. Administrative centralization continued to advance. Provincial councils were created, formed by local notables who had to cooperate with the governors. However, in practice, these bodies strengthened the influence of regional elites. In Lebanon, Bosnia and Bulgaria, the reforms did not prevent conflicts between communities. Foreign powers took advantage of these disputes to broaden their intervention under the pretext of protecting religious minorities. In the Balkans, national movements strengthened. In 1860, the Druze revolt in Lebanon and the massacres of Christians in Damascus showed the fragility of imperial control. The Sublime Porte responded with additional reforms, known as the Organic Regulation, which granted administrative autonomy to some regions. In 1864, a new provincial law was promulgated that reorganized territorial administration into vilayets, sanctioning a more rational and hierarchical model of government. As the bureaucracy grew, so did the distance between the government and the population. Taxes increased and peasants saw few concrete benefits. In the interior of Anatolia, trade routes changed and many villages became marginalized. The reforms, intended to integrate, ended up generating inequality between modernized urban areas and the traditional countryside. In the decade of 1870, the empire was experiencing an atmosphere of tension. The economic crisis, debts, and political instability caused a loss of confidence. European powers, especially Russia and Great Britain, competed for influence. In 1875, rebellions broke out in Bosnia and Herzegovina, followed by uprisings in Bulgaria. The Ottoman repression provoked international outrage and served as a pretext for foreign intervention. In the capital, a new group of intellectuals and officials, known as the Young Ottomans, began to demand a constitution. Inspired by European ideas, they advocated the creation of a parliament and the limitation of the Sultan's absolute power. Among them stood out Namik Kemal and Zia Pasha, who promoted a reformist press and criticized authoritarianism. The death of Abdülaziz in 1876, in confusing circumstances, accelerated the crisis. After a brief reign of Murad V, the throne passed to Abdülhamid II. That same year, Grand Vizier Midhat Pasha promoted the promulgation of the first Ottoman constitution, the Kanun-i Esasi. The document established a bicameral parliament, civil rights, and a modern legal structure. It was the culmination of the reformist movement begun 4 decades earlier. However, the war with Russia in 1877 interrupted the constitutional experiment. The Ottoman army, weakened, suffered defeats that led to the loss of much of the Balkans. Abdulhamid II suspended the constitution and dissolved the parliament, restoring the absolute power of the Sultan. The Tanzimat reforms remained incomplete, trapped between external pressure and internal resistance. Despite its partial failure, the Tanzimat period transformed the structure of the empire. It introduced the notion of citizenship, professionalized the administration, and brought the Ottoman state closer to European models. But it also generated an identity crisis. The elites sought to modernize without abandoning Islamic tradition, while society tried to adapt to a world dominated by foreign powers. In 1876, the empire was at a crossroads. Modernization had changed its institutions, but had not resolved its weaknesses. National tensions, external debt, and European interference continued to undermine its stability. What began as an attempt at renewal ended up revealing the difficulty of reconciling the Ottoman heritage with the demands of the modern century. The end of the empire, from the Balkan Wars to the birth of Turkey. At the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was a weakened state, trying to preserve its unity amidst external pressures and internal tensions. Abdulhamid II, who had ascended the throne in 1876, began his reign with the promulgation of the first Ottoman constitution, the Kanun-i Esasi, drafted by Midhat Pasha. However, barely 1 year later, he suspended the charter and dissolved the parliament. The Sultan argued that the war with Russia required a centralized power, and from then on he governed with personal authority, controlling his ministers and the press through an extensive network of censorship and espionage. The conflict with Russia, which began in 1877, was a disaster for the empire. The Tsarist troops advanced to the gates of Istanbul, and only the diplomatic intervention of the European powers prevented the fall of the capital. The Treaty of San Stefano, later revised at the Congress of Berlin in 1878, reduced the Ottoman presence in the Balkans. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania were recognized as independent states, while Bulgaria obtained autonomy under Russian protection. Bosnia and Herzegovina were occupied by Austria-Hungary. The empire thus lost most of its European domains, a blow that weakened its economy and prestige. Faced with this situation, Abdulhamid II adopted a policy of centralization and conservatism. He re-established the authority of the Caliph as a symbol of Muslim unity and tried to reinforce the loyalty of the Arab provinces by appealing to the Islamic identity. At the same time, he promoted the construction of the Hijaz Railway, which linked Damascus with Medina and expanded the telegraph network. Schools, hospitals, and ministries were built in the capital. The administration was modernized, but under constant surveillance. Christian minorities and liberal intellectuals were persecuted if they questioned the regime. During the following 2 decades, the empire survived largely thanks to the rivalries between the European powers. Great Britain, France, Russia, and Germany competed for influence, and each tried to take advantage of Ottoman weaknesses. In 1881, unable to pay its debts, the state accepted the creation of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, controlled by foreign creditors, which collected taxes and managed revenues such as tobacco. Economic sovereignty was thus limited. Discontent grew among young officers and officials trained in modern schools. In 1889, a group of medical students founded the secret organization of the Young Turks in Istanbul, demanding the re-establishment of the constitution and the end of absolutism. Over time, the movement expanded into exile, especially in Paris, where figures like Ahmed Riza and Prince Sabahaddin organized the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP. Their program combined Turkish nationalism with ideas of modernization and centralization. The opposition strengthened within the army. In 1908, officers of the Third Army, stationed in Macedonia, rebelled and forced the Sultan to re-establish the constitution suspended 3 decades earlier. This event, known as the Young Turk Revolution, ended the autocratic regime. Elections were held in Istanbul and the parliament met again. However, expectations of freedom were soon frustrated. In 1909, a conservative uprising in the capital attempted to restore absolute power. The committee's troops marched on Istanbul, suppressed the revolt, and deposed Abdülhamid II. Mehmed V, a monarch without real power, was proclaimed in his place. The CUP assumed control of the government, dominated by young officers and bureaucrats who wanted to strengthen the state and resist foreign pressures. The new leaders immediately faced serious challenges. Between 1911 and 1912, Italy attacked Libya and occupied Tripoli and the Dodecanese, demonstrating the fragility of the empire. Shortly after, the Balkan nations, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece and Montenegro, formed an alliance and declared war on the Ottomans. In a few weeks, the imperial army was defeated. Successive losses at Kumanovo, Lüleburgaz and Edirne forced them to accept an armistice. Albania declared its independence, and almost all of Macedonia passed into the hands of the Balkan allies. In 1913, the CUP consolidated its power after a coup d'état. The triumvirate formed by Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha and Cemal Pasha took control of the government and the army. The three promoted a policy of Turkish nationalism and accelerated modernization. Administrative reforms were promoted, education was reorganized, and an attempt was made to revitalize the economy through investment in railways and factories. However, resentment over the defeats fueled a climate of militarism and distrust toward minorities. When World War I broke out in 1914, the empire allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Enver Pasha, Minister of War, was confident of recovering lost territories and resisting Russian pressure. In November of that year, Ottoman forces bombed Russian ports on the Black Sea, leading to the official entry into the conflict. The war spread to several fronts: the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and the Dardanelles. On the Eastern Front, Ottoman troops suffered a catastrophic defeat at Sarıkamış during the winter of 1914 to 1915, where tens of thousands of soldiers died of cold. Simultaneously, the government deported the Armenian population of eastern Anatolia, accusing them of collaborating with the enemy. Forced marches to the Syrian desert caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. In 1915, the Allied powers tried to force the passage of the Dardanelles to reach Istanbul. The Turkish forces, led by Mustafa Kemal, successfully resisted at Gallipoli, turning that victory into a national symbol. However, on other fronts the situation was increasingly worse. In 1916, the British occupied Baghdad and encouraged the Arab revolt led by Sharif Hussein of Mecca, with the support of Thomas Edward Lawrence. The Arab movement spread through Syria and Palestine, further weakening Ottoman control. Despite some initial advances, the alliance with Germany ended in defeat. In 1918, the Ottoman army was exhausted, and the civilian population suffered from famine and epidemics. In October of that year, the government signed the Armistice of Mudros, which ended the war and allowed the Allied occupation of strategic points, including Istanbul. Shortly after, the leaders of the triumvirate fled abroad. Once the war ended, a decisive period for the Ottoman destiny began. Since 1919, the Allied powers undertook the partition of the empire. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in 1920, formalized the fragmentation of Anatolia into zones under foreign control. Greece took Smyrna, France took control of Cilicia, and the United Kingdom secured Mesopotamia and Palestine, while an ephemeral Armenian state was recognized in the east. Those impositions unleashed a nationalist reaction that would transform the future of Turkey. In May 1919, Mustafa Kemal, a general respected for his role in Gallipoli, was sent to Samsun with the task of supervising demobilization. Instead of obeying orders, he organized a resistance movement. In the congresses of Erzurum and Sivas, provincial delegates proclaimed the defense of sovereignty and territorial integrity. A new government, separate from the Sultan, was formed in Ankara. The struggle for independence extended between 1919 and 1922. The nationalist forces confronted the Greeks in western Anatolia, defeating them at Sakarya and Dumlupinar. They also resisted pressure from the French in the south and the Armenians in the east. The movement managed to unite different groups under a common banner: the defense of Anatolian territory against foreign occupation. In November 1922, the Ankara Parliament abolished the Sultanate. Mehmed VI left Istanbul aboard a British ship, ending more than 6 centuries of Ottoman monarchy. The following year, the Treaty of Lausanne recognized the borders of the new Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal, having become a national leader, was elected president. The end of the empire marked the disappearance of the last great classical Islamic state. Its territory, which once stretched from Hungary to Yemen, was reduced to Anatolia and a small part of Thrace. The Arab provinces were transformed into mandates administered by the European powers. Internally, the new regime undertook a radical transformation. It abolished the caliphate, adopted the Latin alphabet, and proclaimed the secular nature of the state. Between 1876 and 1923, the Ottoman world collapsed. Wars, territorial losses, and foreign pressures destroyed the structure that had sustained the empire for centuries. What emerged from its ruins was a modern national state, which broke with the imperial past but preserved the memory of its greatness. Thus ended the long cycle initiated by Osman in 1299, with the fall of an empire that had dominated 3 continents, and that, after more than 600 years, yielded its place to a new Turkey.